Welcome back to Pain-Free Living. My name is Dr. Andrew Grecki, owner of Superior Physical Therapy. And again, we're talking about shoulder pain. And in this segment, we're going to talk about what are the most common causes of shoulder pain. Earlier, we talked about the most common diagnosis. We just talked about one, which is rotator cuff tears. Good news is, recent studies show that 75% of people over the age of 60 have a rotator cuff tear, but they have no pain. So that means that there's hope for you. So before I get into the most common body parts that are actually causing stress in the shoulder and damage, which then leads to a tear, it's important to recognize that another diagnosis of shoulder pain is called shoulder impingement syndrome. And that's actually what most people that have shoulder pain are dealing with. And yet it's very commonly not diagnosed that way. So for example, you'll get diagnosed with a rotator cuff tear because the MRI shows that. But in reality, the shoulder impingement syndrome is actually what is creating the pain, the stress and damage, and then ultimately leading to a tear. And so let's really quick talk about what the impingement syndrome mechanism is. So we're going to look at our model here of the shoulder blade and the arm bone. And you can see it's a ball and socket joint, and we have the rotator cuff muscles that go underneath this bony roof, like I mentioned earlier, and that shoulder blade has to move at the same rhythm as the arm bone. And if you have a disconnect, let's say the shoulder blade itself has 21 muscles that attach to it. And if any one of those muscles are tight, then it's going to stop that shoulder blade from rotating up as you lift your arm up. And then the arm will continue and you'll get a squeezing of that space, which happens to squeeze on the rotator cuff tendons. That is called impingement syndrome. The tricky part is that's not detectable on an MRI or an X-ray. So it's the reason why it's very commonly undiagnosed that way. And so let's get into what actually causes the impingement, or that little space where the rotator cuff is, to close down. And there's three causes. Number one is actually the shoulder blade itself not moving, as I just kind of alluded to. It's got 21 muscles that attach to it. Some go to your spine, some go to your neck. But if they don't move, if those are stiff in any one of those, there's a lot of possibilities there. If that shoulder blade doesn't move at the same direction as the arm bone, you're going to get a closing down in the space. So number one, most common cause is actually the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is back here. So if you've got somebody who's focusing on the shoulder joint, they need to get back behind you and get on that shoulder blade. Number two most common cause of that little impingement syndrome, which leads to a rotator cuff if untreated or continues for a long period of time, is actually the upper spine. Okay? So later in the show, we're going to get to quick tips on how to move the spine better. But the idea is that the shoulder blade, as mentioned earlier, needs to move, right? Well, the shoulder blade is like a floating bone, and it floats and it moves along the rib cage. So that's like its track. And the rib cage attaches to the spine. So in order for the shoulder blade to move, it needs the ribs to move as well as the spine to move. So if we have a limitation in our spine movement, it's going to stop the shoulder blade from moving, and again cause the little area in the space in the shoulder to squeeze down and cause compression. That compression causes friction and damage to those little rotator cuff tendons. Inflammation happens because the body's trying to heal itself naturally, and then we end up with a rotator cuff tear along down the road. So number two is shoulder blade. Number three is actually really far away from the shoulder, but it's actually the hips. So we know that when we lift our arm in front of us, overhead, that a lot of things happen. The arm moves, but also the shoulder blade moves back and down. The upper body, the ribs have to extend backwards. And then we get to the hips. The hips actually have to extend. If you don't believe me, here's an easy test. So you just simply take your arms and lift them up as far as you can behind you. Think about how far you went. Now pretend like you're sitting in a chair where you're going to make those little hip muscles shorter, and then try that same motion again. And you're going to be surprised at how hard that feels. You're not going to go as far. And if you're dealing with shoulder pain, it usually increases the shoulder pain intensity. So we know the hip flexors are actually the culprit. They get tight from sitting. Later in the show, I'm going to show you how to get those hip flexors to move a little better so you can have less stress on the shoulder when you lift up in front of you. So there you go. You've got the three most common areas in the body that are actually causing shoulder pain: the shoulder blade, the upper spine, and the hips.